The night air outside Malvern Manor tasted of damp earth and the sharp metallic promise of an approaching storm. But inside the carriage, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old leather and the rhythmic breathing of a man who had seen too many secrets to be afraid of one more. Elara Vance adjusted the silver-threaded lace of her mask, her fingers momentarily brushing the cold, unforgiving edge of the steel blade tucked into the stays of her bodice. It was a slender thing, more of a needle than a sword, but its weight was a grounding presence against her ribs. She did not tremble. She did not hesitate. She simply counted the revolutions of the carriage wheels against the gravel path. 142 since they had passed the iron gates and waited for the world to change. Opposite her, Silas Higgins sat in a shadow so deep it seemed to swallow the rough wool of his coat. The coachman was a man of few words and even fewer smiles, his face a map of weathered lines that told the story of a lifetime spent in the service of people who preferred to remain unseen. He had been the only one to believe her when the letters began to arrive. Those strange, unsigned missives that hinted at her mother's true fate. He had secured the forged invitation and the gown of midnight silk that transformed her into Lady Genevieve, a distant cousin of a deceased countess who no one would think to question. The manor loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette of grey stone and flickering amber light that seemed to leach the warmth from the surrounding forest. Silas leaned forward, the movement causing the carriage to groan. His voice was a low rasp that barely rose above the crunch of the wheels. He warned her that once the doors opened, he could no longer reach her. He reminded her that the lord of the manor was not a man who allowed errors in his ledger. If she was caught, there would be no trial and no rescue. There would only be the silence of the Malvern vaults. Elara looked out the window at the gargoyles leering down from the roofline. She informed Silas she had already spent 7 years in a different kind of silence, the kind that came from a house with an empty chair and a mother who had vanished into the London fog without a single footprint left behind. She had spent those years training her mind to see the patterns others missed and to move through high society like a ghost in the machine. She was not a victim seeking charity. She was a surveyor assessing a ruin. The dagger was not a tool of murder. It was a weapon of her survival. The carriage came to a halt with a final decisive jerk. Silas descended from the box, and a moment later, the door was pulled open. A flood of artificial light spilled into the cabin, smelling of expensive beeswax and hothouse lilies. The coachman offered his hand, his grip firm and calloused. As she stepped down, the silk of her skirts hissed against the step, a sound like a warning. She offered Silas a brief, nearly imperceptible nod, a final entry in the private ledger of their partnership, and turned toward the grand staircase. Malvern Manor was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation. The limestone pillars rose like the ribs of a great beast, and the portraits, lining the foyer, tracked her movement with painted eyes. Every footfall on the polished marble was a risk, a declaration of presence in a space designed for exclusion. She adjusted her reticule, feeling the small, metallic-bound journal and the sharpened lead pencil hidden within its velvet depths. It was a tool of fine craftsmanship, her fingers already familiar with the texture of the vellum pages, where she would record the truth of the order. Tonight, these records would be her shield, or they would be buried with her. She moved through the foyer with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime studying the choreography of the powerful. To the footman, she was merely another aristocratic bird in expensive plumage, a Lady Genevieve, whose pedigree was as impeccable as her posture. They did not see the calluses on her fingertips from hours of picking locks, nor did they notice the way her eyes scanned the perimeter for guards and the subtle discolorations in the wood that suggested hidden panels. She was the silent architect of her own infiltration, measuring the room not by its beauty, but by its vulnerabilities. The ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions of light over hundreds of masked guests who moved in a slow tide of silk and velvet. The music was a frantic violin melody that seemed to mimic the racing of a heart. Elara took a glass of champagne from a passing tray to give her hands a purpose. She stood at the edge of the dance floor, a shadow in midnight blue, and began the meticulous work of observation. She was looking for the sign, the crimson rose pinned to a lapel, or the specific tilt of a mask that would mark a member of the society. In the third minute of her survey, the air seemed to grow colder, and the laughter of the guests thinned into a polite murmur. From the far end of the hall, a figure emerged from the shadows of a velvet curtain. Alistair Thorne, the Duke of Malvern, did not wear a mask. His face was a sculpture of pale, aristocratic indifference, his grey eyes like chips of winter ice that pierced through the pretenses of everyone they touched. He moved through the crowd without acknowledging the fawning bows, his presence carrying the weight of centuries. He was younger than the rumors suggested, but there was a stillness about him that felt dangerous. He was searching for something, or someone. Elara felt a prickle of alarm at the base of her neck. She had spent years imagining this man as a monster who had snatched her mother to hide some dark aristocratic sin. Seeing him now, he did not look like a common criminal. He looked like a man who functioned with the cold, mathematical certainty of a clock. The Duke's gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on each face before moving on with a flicker of boredom. When those winter-grey eyes finally landed on her, Elara did not look away. She simply stood her ground, her spine as straight as a ledger line, and met his stare with a quiet, measured dignity. For a moment, the ballroom seemed to vanish. He began to move toward her, the crowd parting before him like water before a prow. He stopped exactly 3 paces away. He did not offer a hand. He did not smile. He simply observed her for a long heartbeat, his eyes tracking the line of her throat and the quality of the lace on her mask. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried the authority of a man who had never been told no. He noted that he did not recognize her, yet she stood in his house as if she had helped lay the foundations. Elara curtsied, a perfect, heartbeat-delayed gesture of a woman who knew her worth and granted respect only when it was earned. She introduced herself as Lady Genevieve, claiming a lineage that was technically extinct, but historically obscure enough to pass a casual audit. She spoke levelly, her tone a mirror of his own. She explained she was a traveller who appreciated architecture, and that Malvern Manor was a structure that whispered many things to those who knew how to listen. Alistair tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. He remarked that most of his guests heard only the music and the gossip. He offered his arm, inviting her to dance and suggesting that the rhythm of the floor might reveal more than a stationary conversation. The Duke's hand was warm through the silk of her glove. As they stepped onto the floor, the violins surged into a waltz that felt like a descent into a whirlpool. Alistair moved with mechanical precision, his steps perfectly timed to the music, forcing Elara to match his pace or risk a public stumble. It was a test disguised as a social grace. He steered her through the dancers, his movements calculated to isolate them in the center of the room, where every word could be muffled by the surrounding noise. He began to probe her history, asking after estates and relatives with a casualness that masked a razor-sharp intellect. He mentioned the specific vintage of the champagne they had just shared, noting its origin in a vineyard that had been destroyed 20 years ago. He waited for her to agree or lie. Elara, however, did not falter. She had spent her nights memorizing the lineages of the peerage and the complex etiquette of the sanguine order. She corrected him quietly, noting that the vineyard was not destroyed, but merely rebranded under a different charter after the Napoleonic Wars. The Duke's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine interest replacing the mask of boredom. He remarked that she was a woman of rare technical detail. He noted that most ladies found such history tedious, preferring the ledger of scandals to the ledger of economics. He asked her, his voice dropping an octave, if she believed that everything in the world could be quantified and balanced. He spun her toward a mirror, forcing her to look at their twin reflections, 2 figures in blue and black, moving in perfect, forced harmony. Elara looked at his reflection, her expression unreadable behind the silver lace. She told him that balance was the only truth she trusted. She said that every debt eventually came due, and every secret had a cost. The air between them seemed to vibrate with the subtext of her words. She was not talking about wine or dancing. She was talking about her mother and the justice she had come to claim. Alistair did not pull away. Instead, he drew her a fraction closer, his breath warm against her temple. He whispered that Malvern was a house built on debts, some so old they had become part of the mortar. He warned her that seeking to balance a ledger that old was a dangerous game. one that often resulted in the auditor becoming part of the debt themselves. He looked at her then as a master, looking at a student who had suddenly revealed a hidden weapon. The dance ended with a final, booming chord from the orchestra. The Duke released her with a bow that was a masterpiece of formal distance. He remarked that he looked forward to seeing how she navigated the rest of the evening, for the house had a way of testing those who arrived with such a straight spine. As he turned to rejoin the shadows, Elara stood alone on the floor, her heart hammering against the hidden blade. She had survived the first audit. Now the real work began. She watched him disappear toward the darkened corridors of the West Wing, where the library and the secrets it held awaited. She waited for exactly 10 seconds before she began her own descent into the dark. The temperature in the West Wing dropped with every step Elara Vance took away from the frantic pulse of the ballroom. The air here was not perfumed with lilies or the sweat of dancing aristocrats. It tasted of centuries-old dust and the dry, alkaline scent of crumbling vellum. She moved through the shadows with the ghost-like precision of a surveyor who had already mapped the terrain in her mind before setting foot on the soil. Every 10 paces, she paused, her heart a steady, muffled drum against the needle blade in her bodice. She did not rush, she did not panic, she measured the silence. The Library of Malvern was not a collection of bound paper. It was a fortress of recorded debts, the tall oak shelves rising like the walls of a canyon that swallowed the faint, flickering light of the single candle she carried. She reached the massive mahogany doors of the library and felt the weight of the brass handles. They were cold, the metal biting into the silk of her gloves. She counted to 3, a rhythmic internal calibrations, and turned the mechanism. The door groaned, a low tectonic sound that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the manor. But she did not hesitate. She slipped inside, the darkness of the room wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. The smell of beeswax and old leather was thick here, a sensory anchor that grounded her as she began her search. She was not looking for a book. She was looking for a seam in the world the Duke had built. Her fingers trailed along the spines of the volumes on the south wall, her touch light enough to detect the subtle variations in the grain of the wood. She was looking for a specific friction, a technical flaw in the perfection of the craftsmanship. To a casual observer, the library was a monument to learning. To Elara, it was a puzzle box waiting for the right key. She found it behind a collection of ancient legal treatises on property law, a small, recessed lever disguised as a decorative molding. It was a matter of mechanics, not of magic. She pulled the lever, and the sound of counterweights, shifting behind the stone, was a symphony of hidden engineering. A section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a staircase that descended into the throat of the earth. She did not look back at the faint amber glow of the corridor. She did not offer a prayer for her safety. She simply adjusted the silver-cased notebook in her reticule and began the descent. The stairs were narrow and damp, the stones sweating with the moisture of the subterranean depths. She counted each step, 34, 35, 36, maintaining the rhythmic pace that kept her fear at bay. At the bottom, the air changed, becoming sharp with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of iron. She was standing before the sanguine vault, the heavy iron doors embossed with the image of a thorned rose. It was a door designed to keep the world out, but for Elara, it was the threshold of her reckoning. She pressed herself into a shallow alcove as a group of figures emerged from a side passage. They were shrouded in robes of deep crimson, their faces hidden behind masks of polished bone that caught the flickering light of the torches lining the walls. They moved with a synchronized, ritualistic gait, their boots clicking against the flagstones in a cadence that mimicked the ticking of a clock. Elara watched them through a narrow slit in the stonework, her eyes narrowing as she recorded the number of participants. 12, a jury of shadows. She followed them at a distance, her footsteps silenced by the thick, damp moss that clung to the floor. The passage opened into a vast, circular chamber that looked like the hollowed-out heart of a mountain. The walls were lined with black marble, and in the center of the room stood a long, obsidian table that reflected the torchlight like a pool of dark water. This was the sanctum of the Order of the Crimson Rose. The figures took their seats, the rustle of their robes, the only sound in the oppressive silence. At the head of the table, sat a man whose presence felt like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Even from her vantage point behind a heavy velvet curtain, Elara recognized the sharp, predatory lines of Julian Sterling. Lord Sterling did not move with the Duke's measured grace. He moved with the twitchy, repressed energy of a man who was constantly calculating the cost of everyone in the room. He reached into a leather satchel and pulled out a stack of documents. The records of the Order's true commerce. These were not records of charity or philosophy. They were the blueprints of social destruction. He began to speak, his voice a cold, precise instrument that carved through the silence. He was trading secrets like currency. A cabinet minister's gambling debts for a naval commander's disgraced brother. A duchess's infidelity for a judge's forged inheritance. It was a market of misery, a private art of survival built on the ruins of others. Elara reached into her reticule and withdrew her the silver-cased notebook. It was a tool of fine craftsmanship, its vellum pages prepared to receive the ink of truth. The notebook was not a collection of paper. It was a ledger of her enemies' sins. Each graphite stroke a nail in the coffin of their arrogance. She did not need a lens to capture the betrayal. She possessed the eyes of an auditor and the hand of a master clerk. She began to transcribe the names, the dates, and the specific leverages Sterling was currently detailing. Her pencil moved with a rhythmic, silent urgency, recording the flow of corrupt capital with the same clinical detachment she used for an estate audit. She did not blink. She did not pull away. She watched as Sterling handed a particularly thick dossier to a man at the far end of the table. The transaction was a matter of cold mathematical logic, a trade of leverage for loyalty. She recorded the exchange, the graphite marks documenting the betrayal in permanent, unforgiving detail. Sterling was the architect of this corruption, but he was merely a tenant in a house he didn't understand. He spoke of the Order as his own, his arrogance a blind spot that Elara intended to exploit with the precision of a surgeon. She noted the seal on the dossier, a crest she had seen before in the Duke's private correspondence. The connection was a thread she began to weave into her mental map of the conspiracy. As the meeting began to dissolve into smaller whispered conversations, Elara turned her attention to the walls of the vault. She had been searching for a sign, a mark of Miriam's presence in this den of thieves. She moved her candle closer to a mural that depicted the history of the Malvern lineage, her eyes scanning the intricate floral borders. There, tucked between a rendering of a Tudor rose and a Victorian lily, she found it, a unique, stylized cipher of petals that defied any known botanical classification. It was the floral cipher, a visual code her mother, Miriam Vance, had used to hide messages in the margins of her childhood storybooks. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, though she did not allow so much as a gasp to escape her lips. She did not weep for the mother she thought she had lost. She did not scream at the hypocrisy of the room. She stood, a silent, grey figure against the black marble, and analyzed the pattern. The petals were not merely decorative, they were a set of coordinates. To the left, 3. To the right, 7. Descending toward the base of the mural. It was a set of instructions, a legacy written in a language only she could read. Her mother had not been a victim of this society. She had been its founder. Elara adjusted her mask, the silver lace feeling like a cold hand against her skin. She looked at Julian Sterling, who was now laughing with a group of conspirators, his hand resting on the very table where the secrets of the realm were sold. He thought he was the master of this house, but he was standing in a room built by the woman he had likely helped to exile. The Sanguine Vault was not a prison for her maternal legacy. It was a monument to her intellect. But the Duke, Alistair Thorne, remained a variable she could not yet solve. He was a man of the Order, yet he watched Sterling with a gaze that tasted of tempered steel rather than camaraderie. A haunting suspicion began to take root. Perhaps the Duke was not the enemy she intended to expose, but a guardian of a truth far more dangerous. She began to retreat toward the staircase, her movements fluid and controlled. She had the evidence she needed recorded in her notebook, the names of the traitors and the coordinates of the next clue. She counted her steps as she climbed, each one bringing her closer to the library and the cold, grey reality of the manor above. She was no longer just a journalist seeking a story. She was an auditor, returning to settle a debt that had been compounding for 7 years. The legacy of Miriam Vance was etched into the very stones of the manor, and the Duke's involvement was a ledger entry that required further verification. She reached the top of the stairs and pressed the lever, the bookshelf sliding back into place with a definitive click that signaled the end of her first inventory. She stood in the library, the moonlight filtering through the high windows and painting the floor in shades of silver and ash. She adjusted her skirts, smoothed the lace of her gloves, and walked toward the door. She was Lady Genevieve once more, a quiet, observant guest in a house of secrets. But as she stepped back into the corridor, her heart was not hammering. It was ticking with the relentless, unyielding certainty of a clock that was finally, after a long and bitter winter, striking the hour of its own reckoning. The next step was the Duke's study, and the crimson rose ledger that awaited her there. The corridor leading to the Duke's private study was a gauntlet of shadows and silence, smelling faintly of linseed oil, and the lingering, ghostly scent of expensive tobacco. Elara Vance did not move with the haste of a thief. She moved with the calculated grace of an auditor arriving for a scheduled appointment. She counted the paces between the library and the carved oak doors of the study. 43 steps, each one a rhythmic measurement of her own resolve. The silver-threaded lace of her mask felt heavy against her skin, a physical reminder of the Lady Genevieve persona she still wore. But her mind was already elsewhere. She was focused on the coordinates she had extracted from the mural in the vault. 3 to the left, 7 to the right, descending. The floral cipher was not merely a memory of Miriam's bedtime stories. It was a map of the manor's secret architecture. She reached the study doors and paused, her hand hovering inches from the polished brass handle. She did not breathe. She did not tremble. She listened to the house. Somewhere in the distance, the muffled strains of a violin concerto still drifted from the ballroom, a thin, frantic melody that seemed to mock the stillness of the West Wing. To the guests below, this manor was a playground of privilege. To Elara, it was a ledger of unresolved debts. She pressed her ear to the wood, hearing only the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock from within. She drew the small steel needle from her stays, a slender tool of survival, and felt for the resistance in the lock. It was a matter of mechanical pressure, not of brute force. The tumblers surrendered with a muted, metallic click that echoed in the hollow of her chest. The study was a cathedral of industry, bathed in the pale, flickering amber of a dying fire. The air here was thicker, tasting of old parchment, iron gall ink, and the cold mineral scent of the Malvern stone. Elara stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the latch catching with the finality of a closing book. She did not immediately begin her search. Instead, she stood at the edge of the room and measured its contents with the clinical eye of a surveyor. The walls were lined with ledgers and maps, not paintings or trophies. A large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with architectural drawings and mathematical instruments. The Duke was not a man of leisure. He was a man of logistics. She moved toward the desk, her footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rug. Her eyes scanned the surface, landing on a small recessed panel near the inkwell. She recalled the floral cipher, the coordinates of the petals. 3, 7, descending. She pressed the corresponding carvings on the desk's edge, her fingers finding the subtle indentations that most would have mistaken for decorative wear. There was a faint hiss of compressed air, and a hidden drawer slid open with the smoothness of a well-oiled machine. Inside lay a leather-bound book, its cover worn to the color of dark mahogany and embossed with a single thorned rose. The book was not a collection of memories. It was a contract with the darkness. Elara reached for it, her fingers brushing the cool, supple leather. She did not hesitate. She opened the cover, and the sight of the handwriting on the first page caused her heart to stutter for the briefest of seconds. It was a sharp, elegant script with a distinctive slant to the capital letters, a hand she had spent her childhood imitating in the margins of her schoolbooks. It was the unmistakable handwriting of Miriam Vance. The date at the top of the entry was marked only weeks before her mother's disappearance 7 years ago. She began to read, her eyes racing across the vellum pages. The entries were not the pleas of a victim or the frantic notes of a woman in hiding. They were the directives of a commander. Her mother spoke of the Crimson Society as something she had cultivated from the soil, a society designed to act as a shadow treasury for the realm. a check against the corruption of a parliament that had grown fat on the suffering of the invisible. Miriam Vance was not the Duke's prisoner. She was the architect. She had built the vault, designed the rituals, and established the network of leverage that Ilara had witnessed in the subterranean chamber. The realization was a cold blade to the ribs, sharper than any steel she carried. She had spent 7 years fueled by the righteous fire of a daughter seeking a martyr. She had imagined her mother in a damp cell, or buried in an unmarked grave, a victim of aristocratic cruelty. Instead, she found a woman who had faked her own death to lead an empire from the shadows, leaving her daughter behind like an unneeded ledger entry. She did not cry. She did not scream. She stood in the Duke's study, her spine as straight as a needle, and felt the final, bitter winter of her childhood end in a freeze of pure, analytical clarity. Her mother had not been taken. She had simply moved to a different office. A floorboard creaked behind her, a sound so soft it would have been lost to anyone not attuned to the grammar of silence. Ilara did not spin around. She did not reach for her dagger. She simply closed the journal with a deliberate, steady hand and turned slowly to face the shadows near the fireplace. Alistair Thorne, the master of the estate, stood there, his tall frame leaning against a bookshelf, his arms crossed over his chest. He had removed his mask, and his winter-grey eyes were fixed on her with a gaze that was neither angry nor surprised. It was the gaze of a master watching a student complete a difficult proof, he remarked, his voice a low, resonant baritone, that she had found the architect's records much faster than he had anticipated. He noted that the floral cipher was a difficult code to break for those who had not been raised on its syntax. Ilara did not flinch. She stood her ground, the journal still held firmly in her hand. She asserted she was not a guest, and she was certainly not a student. She informed him that she was the daughter of the woman who had built this house of secrets, and she was here to balance the ledger. Alistair moved into the circle of firelight, his movements fluid and measured. He did not call for the guards. He did not threaten her with the law. Instead, he walked to the desk and poured 2 measures of dark brandy into crystal tumblers. He said that balancing a ledger required an understanding of all the entries, not just the ones that favored her narrative. He offered her a glass, his eyes tracking the way she held her posture, even in the face of exposure. He explained that Miriam Vance had not disappeared because of his malice, but because of her own ambition. He revealed that he had been her mother's protégé, the one chosen to maintain the society's infrastructure while she operated from the periphery. He watched her then, waiting for the expected outburst of grief or denial, but Ilara Vance did not break. She set the journal on the desk and looked him directly in the eye, her expression a mask of stoic defiance. She asked him if her mother's ambition included the trade of human misery she had seen in the vault, the blackmail, the leveraged lives, the market of secrets. She noted that Sterling seemed to believe the Order was a criminal syndicate in the making. Alistair's expression darkened, a flicker of genuine distaste crossing his aristocratic features. He admitted that the society had drifted. He said that since Miriam had moved deeper into the shadows, men like Julian Sterling had begun to treat the architect's tools as weapons for their own profit. The Duke stepped closer, the smell of brandy and cold stone surrounding them. He confessed he had been watching her since she entered the ballroom, not because he suspected a spy, but because he recognized the gait. He said she walked with the same quiet authority as her mother, as if the floor belonged to her by right of design. He informed her that he was not her enemy, but a man drowning in a legacy he could no longer control alone. He asked her, his voice dropping to a whisper, if she was here merely to expose the truth to the newspapers, or if she was here to save what her mother had built before Sterling turned it into a slaughterhouse. Ilara looked at the leather-bound book on the desk, then back at the Duke. She was no longer just a journalist seeking a headline. She was a surveyor standing at the center of a collapsing structure. The Duke was not a villain. He was a steward who had been left with a burden too heavy for one pair of hands. She felt the weight of the silver-cased notebook in her reticule, filled with the names of the traitors, and the weight of the dagger in her bodice. Both were tools of her trade, but neither would suffice for what was coming. She did not offer her hand in friendship. She did not promise her trust. She disclosed she had spent 7 years learning to see the cracks in the foundation of the world. She said that if Julian Sterling intended to burn the house down, he would find that she was the one who knew exactly where the water was kept. Alistair tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first genuine emotion she had seen from him. He remarked that Miriam had often said her daughter was the only variable she couldn't account for. He raised his glass in a silent toast, his eyes acknowledging her not as a guest but as an equal. The grandfather clock in the corner struck the hour, midnight, the time of reckoning. The sound was a heavy, metallic chime that seemed to vibration through the floorboards. Alistair set his glass down, the click of the crystal against the mahogany a final decisive note. He warned her that the lockdown would begin soon, and that Sterling's men were already moving to secure the vault. He cautioned that the truth behind Miriam's vanishing was only the first entry in a very long and dangerous book. If she stayed, she would be more than a spy. She would be a target. Elara adjusted the latch of her gloves, her fingers steady. She stated she had been a target since the day her mother walked out the door. She said that she was an auditor of souls, and she did not leave a job until the ledger was perfectly balanced. She looked out the window at the storm-tossed trees of the Malvern estate, the moonlight catching the silver thread of her mask. The house was cold, the secrets were dark, and the debt was ancient. But as she stood beside the Duke in the fading light of the fire, she felt a strange, expansive sense of clarity. The mission had changed. She had set out to expose the society, but she would stay to command it. The architect's daughter had finally come home, and the reckoning was just beginning. The fire in the hearth shifted, a single ember popping with the sudden, sharp violence of a pistol shot in the stifling quiet of the study. Elara Vance did not flinch. She did not allow the sudden noise to disrupt the rhythmic, analytical pulse of her thoughts. She stood with her fingers still grazing the leather of the crimson rose ledger, her touch a light exploratory pressure that felt for the truth beneath the grain. Beside her, Alistair Thorne remained a silent, watchful presence, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the mahogany desk. The air between them was no longer thick with the suspicion of a predator and its prey. It had transformed into the heavy, pressurized atmosphere of two architects standing before a collapsing wall. The Duke's revelation hung in the room like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Miriam Vance, the woman Elara had mourned as a victim, was the sovereign of this shadow kingdom. The threat, however, was no longer a matter of historical mystery. It was a ledger of imminent insolvency and moral ruin. Alistair reached across the desk, his hand steady as he withdrew a second, thinner volume from a hidden shelf beneath the architectural drawings. It was bound in rough, unpolished calfskin, lacking the elegant, embossed rose of her mother's journal. This was a record of deviation. He laid it open before her, the ink-gall script appearing cramped and aggressive compared to her mother's flowing hand. He explained, his voice a low, level baritone, that this was the ledger Julian Sterling had been keeping in secret. It was not a record of stewardship or protection. It was a manifest of exploitation. Alistair pointed to a series of entries dated over the last 18 months. He noted that the Sanguine Order had been founded by Miriam to act as a stabilizer for the realm's economy, a private treasury that could move where the government was too slow or too corrupt to act. It was meant to be a shield for the invisible. But Sterling had begun to turn the shield into a blade. He was using the society's network of informants to harvest secrets, not for the sake of the state, but for the sake of a private criminal enterprise. The blackmail she had witnessed in the vault was only the surface. Sterling intended to use the Order's assets to trigger a controlled collapse of the grain markets, profiting from the resulting famine to consolidate power over the local magistracy. Elara leaned over the desk, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers and names. She did not feel the heat of anger. She felt the cold, familiar clarity of an audit. She tracked the flow of capital from the Malvern accounts to a series of shell charters in the London docks. It was a matter of mathematics, not of emotion. She noted that Sterling had already compromised 3 of the 12 members she had counted in the vault. The coup was not a possibility. It was a process already in its final stages. The Duke admitted that his own authority had been eroded, his movements tracked by men who once swore loyalty to the architect. He said that he was a steward whose keys no longer turned the locks. She looked at Alistair, her gaze searching the winter-grey depths of his eyes for a flicker of deception. She found only the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting a silent, private war of attrition. She pointed out that a ledger in such a state of imbalance could not be fixed with a simple correction. She said that a total restoration of the accounts was required, and that meant the removal of the fraudulent entries. The dagger in her bodice was not a piece of steel. It was a punctuation mark on a 7-year sentence of silence. She was prepared to use the tools of her survival to protect the legacy her mother had seemingly abandoned. Alistair did not disagree. Instead, he moved toward a large, framed map of the Malvern estate that dominated the northern wall. He noted how Miriam Vance had been a woman who understood the inevitability of human greed. She had built the order with the knowledge that it might one day be corrupted, and she had hidden a failsafe within the house itself. A master key that could override the society's administrative controls and freeze its assets before Sterling could liquidate them. He pressed a specific point on the map, a small, unremarkable intersection of 2 bridle paths. There was a click, a sound of heavy brass gears engaging behind the wainscoting, and the map swung outward to reveal a narrow, stone-lined chamber. The room beyond was a sanctum of pure mechanical ingenuity. It tasted of cool, damp earth and the heavy, sweet scent of machine oil. In the center of the small space stood a pedestal of polished granite, and upon it sat a device that defied the simple categories of the age. It was a complex, multi-tiered arrangement of brass gears, silver dials, and thin, oscillating rods of steel. It was the clockwork heart of the Malvern secrets. Alistair led her inside, the light from his handheld taper reflecting off the polished surfaces of the machine. He revealed this was the architect's final message to her successor. The device was not a clock, though it ticked with a relentless rhythmic pulse that echoed the beating of a heart. It was a physical manifestation of a cipher, a mechanical brain designed to hold the final master key to the society's subterranean vaults and its global network of financial charters. Elara moved closer, her fingers itching to touch the intricate brass latticework. She saw the familiar patterns of the floral cipher etched into the base of the machine, petals and thorns that moved in synchronization with the rotation of the gears. It was a masterpiece of technical restoration, a tool that required the precision of a mind trained in both logic and aesthetics to operate. Alistair reached into the mechanism and withdrew a slender, multi-pronged key. Of aged brass, he held it out to her, the weight of the intricate metal key apparent in the way it caught the light. He said that this key was the only thing standing between Julian Sterling and total dominance over the Order. He explained that Miriam had designed the device to only release the key when a specific sequence of coordinates was entered, a sequence she had hidden in the nursery stories and the bedtime maps of Elara's childhood. He looked at her then, a profound respect softening the hard lines of his face. He admitted he had spent years trying to solve the machine's final puzzle, but he had lacked the specific vocabulary of a daughter's memory. Elara took the key, the cold metal biting into her palm. It was not a literal thing, it was a contract with her own destiny. She did not feel the rush of triumph. She felt the heavy, expansive weight of stewardship. She realized that her mother had not left her a map to find a parent. She had left her a blueprint to find a purpose. The device continued its steady, methodical ticking, a sound that measured the dwindling minutes before the house-wide lockdown would begin. Sterling would be moving now, his men securing the corridors and the vault, unaware that the daughter of the woman who built their world was now holding the key to its destruction. She warned Alistair that they did not have the luxury of a slow restoration. She said that they must move to the vault before Sterling could trigger the emergency protocols. The Duke nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his dress sword, a gesture of service that acknowledged her as the new authority in the room. He told her that there was a secondary passage, a route known only to the architect and her protégé, that led directly from this hidden sanctum to the heart of the Sanguine Vault. He warned her that once they crossed the threshold, there would be no turning back. The ledger of their lives would be finalized tonight. Elara adjusted the slim metal-bound folio in her reticule, feeling the graphite of her records against the brass of the master key. She thought of the 7 years she had spent in the cold, grey silence of her mourning, The hours she had spent auditing the books of strangers while her own house was in ruins. She thought of the woman who had planned this test from the shadows, her mother who loved her not with the warmth of a hearth, but with the cold, unyielding precision of a master builder. She was no longer Lady Genevieve, the observant guest. She was Elara Vance, the auditor of the Crimson Rose. They stepped toward the darkened archway at the back of the chamber, the air turning colder as the scent of the subterranean stone returned. Elara counted her breaths, maintaining the rhythmic discipline that had allowed her to survive the ballroom and the study. She was the silent architect of the coming reckoning, measuring the distance not in feet, but in the certainty of her own competence. The house was a machine of secrets, and she was the only one who truly understood how the gears were meant to turn. As they descended into the throat of the manor, the ticking of the clockwork device faded, replaced by the low, tectonic rumble of the house settling into its final high-stakes configuration. The debt was ancient, the interest was high, and the time for payment had finally arrived. The first iron gate descended with the sudden, jarring finality of a guillotine blade, the heavy metal shrieking as it bit into the stone floor of the passage. Elara Vance did not scream. She did not retreat. She stood perfectly still, her hand still closed around the cold, multi-pronged weight of the brass clockwork key, and measured the sound. The echo took exactly 4 seconds to die in the throat of the tunnel, a rhythmic, hollow resonance that signaled the house had officially transitioned from a residence into a fortress. The air, previously cool and damp, was suddenly thick with the smell of scorched iron and the dry, ancient dust of the manor's internal mechanisms. The lockdown had begun, not as a malfunction, but as a deliberate act of administrative sabotage. From a shadowed alcove 20 feet above them, a voice rang out, amplified by the brass speaking tubes that Miriam Vance had woven into the very fabric of the Malvern walls. It was the voice of Julian Sterling, stripped of its social polish and sharpened into a blade of pure, predatory intent. He did not sound like a man in the midst of a crime. He sounded like a man finalizing a transaction. He announced to the unseen guards and the masked members of the Order that the manor's master had been compromised. He proclaimed that Alistair Thorne had been found in the company of a foreign spy, attempting to liquidate the Society's emergency reserves for personal gain. The lie was precise, a masterwork of professional framing that used the Duke's own secretive nature as the primary evidence of his guilt. Alistair stood beside Elara, his jaw set in a line of grim, aristocratic stoicism. He did not shout back at the shadows. He did not waste his breath on denials that the stone would only swallow. Instead, he reached for the hilt of his sword, his eyes fixed on the portcullis that now separated them from the sanctum. He whispered that Sterling had moved faster than the internal ledger had predicted. He noted that the man must have already secured the loyalty of the manor's master at arms, turning the Order's own defensive protocols into a cage for its leaders. The betrayal was absolute, a calculated insolvency of trust that left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the key in Elara's hand. Elara adjusted the silver-cased notebook in her reticule, her fingers finding the graphite pencil. She was not a victim of the trap. She was the auditor who had finally found the fraudulent entry. She reminded Alistair that a man who used a house as a weapon often forgot that the house had its own memory. She noted that Sterling was operating the manor's defenses, using the secondary control panel in the guardroom, a station her mother had designed as a decoy for precisely this kind of insurrection. The real heart of the manor was not in the iron gates or the shouted commands, but in the interstitial spaces where the gears breathed. She turned away from the blocked passage and moved toward a section of the wall where the dampness seemed to form a specific dark pattern on the limestone. She recalled the bedtime maps Miriam had drawn for her, sketches of a hollow house where a girl could walk between the thoughts of the adults. It was a matter of childhood memory transformed into technical data. She pressed her thumb against a small protruding fossil in the stone, a trilobite that seemed out of place in the English masonry. There was a faint pneumatic hiss, and a narrow seam opened in the rock, smelling of stagnant water and the sharp, metallic tang of old grease. They slipped into the wall, the darkness of the narrow corridor pressing against them like a physical weight. Alistair followed her, his breathing steady despite the rising tension. He remarked that he had lived in Malvern for 20 years and had never suspected that the stones themselves were hollow. Elara did not look back. She explained that Miriam had built the manor with the philosophy that a ruler should never be the only person with a key. She said that Miriam Vance had designed the architect's path as a failsafe for the day the students decided they no longer needed the teacher. The path was a labyrinth of vertical shafts and horizontal crawl spaces, a sensory landscape of rough-hewn stone and the rhythmic tectonic grinding of the manor's primary clockwork. Elara counted the rotations of the great lead weights as they passed the central shaft. One every 12 seconds, a pulse that regulated the entire society's administrative flow. She was the silent architect of their escape, measuring their progress by the temperature of the air and the specific vibration of the floors above. To the guards in the corridors, they were ghosts. To the manor, they were the rightful occupants returning to claim the ledger. As they neared the subterranean level of the sanguine vault, the sound of voices began to seep through the ventilation grates, a low, discordant murmur of panic and greed. The masked members of the Order were gathering for the emergency meeting Sterling had convened. Elara paused at a small iron-barred opening that overlooked the main chamber. Below them, the 12 crimson-robed figures were standing around the obsidian table, their bone-white masks flickering in the torchlight like a collection of skulls. At the head of the table, Julian Sterling was holding a parchment, a forged decree of succession that would grant him total control over the society's assets. He was speaking of a new era, a rationalization of the Order's purpose that prioritized profit and political dominance over the silent stewardship Miriam Vance had intended. He was selling the transition as a necessity, a response to the Duke's betrayal. Elara watched as the members shifted, their body language revealing a mixture of fear and opportunistic hunger. They were not a council of protectors. They were a ledger of debts waiting for a new master to forgive them. The corruption she had suspected for 7 years was finally laid bare, a rot that had started at the head and worked its way down to the very foundations. Alistair looked through the grate, his hand tightening on the iron bars until his knuckles turned as white as the masks below. He whispered that if Sterling signed that decree, the society's gold and its secrets would be liquidated by Mourning, funding a coup that would drown the realm in blood. He asked Elara if she was ready to use the master mechanism, for its activation would trigger the master reset of the manor's entire legal and physical infrastructure. It would be a total restoration of the broken house, but it would also reveal their presence to everyone in the room. Elara reached into her bodice and felt the cold steel of the needle blade, then touched the silver-cased notebook. She insisted that an unmasking required more than just a key. It required the evidence to make the masks meaningless. She said that she did not come here to be a witness to a crime, but to be the final entry in the audit of Julian Sterling's soul. The brass clockwork key was not a piece of cold metal. It was the physical manifest of a daughter's inheritance. She was no longer the daughter of a missing woman. She was the inheritor of the architect's vision. She moved to the final lever, a rusted iron handle hidden behind a pile of discarded masonry. She did not hesitate. She did not pray. She simply calculated the force required and pulled. The sound was not a scream, but a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the very marrow of the manor. The walls of the sanguine vault did not collapse. They shifted. The obsidian table split down the center, and the murals of the floral cipher began to rotate, revealing the hidden sanctum behind the black marble. Elara stepped from the shadows and onto the raised dais at the back of the chamber, her midnight blue silk gown shimmering like a bruise in the torchlight. She had removed her lace mask, her face a sculpture of stoic, unyielding dignity. Alistair Thorne stood beside her, his presence a silent, armored testimony to her authority. The 12 masked figures froze, their heads turning as one toward the sudden apparition. Julian Sterling dropped the forged decree, the parchment fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. The silence that followed was not the silence of a grave. It was the silence of a courtroom before a sentence is read. Elara looked down at the men who had traded their integrity for a seat at a table of shadows. She did not shout. She did not weep for the betrayal of her mother's dream. She spoke levelly, her voice a low, authoritative instrument that filled every corner of the vault. She announced to the room that the ledger of the Sanguine Society was out of balance, and she was there to settle the accounts. She informed them that the man who stood before them was not a leader but a common thief who had mistaken the keys of the house for the right to own it. Sterling recovered his composure with the practiced ease of a career liar. He pointed a trembling finger at her and shouted for the guards, claiming that she was the spy who had led the Duke astray. He told the council that she was a commoner in an expensive dress, a girl who knew nothing of the ancient debts they served. But Alara did not flinch. She reached into her reticule and withdrew the gleaming record book, holding it aloft so the torchlight caught the graphite records of Sterling's private criminal enterprise. She began to read the entries, the dates of the grain market manipulations, the names of the bribed magistrates, and the specific coordinates of the shell charters Sterling had established in the London docks. She used the technical terminology of the society, the grammar of the floral cipher, and the mathematical certainty of the architect's own records. Each word was a rhythmic blow against the usurper's arrogance, a clinical dismantling of his legitimacy that left him standing naked in the light of the morning truth. The masked members began to murmur, their masks turning towards Sterling with a new, dangerous curiosity. The intricate brass key was not a tool for unlocking doors. It was an instrument of fiscal and moral judgment. Alara stepped to the central pedestal and inserted the key into the master lock of the vault. As she turned it, the gears of the manor groaned in a final, expansive symphony of mechanical restoration. The lockdown bars retracted, the iron gates rose, and the manor's primary charters, the physical records of the society's wealth, rose from the center of the obsidian table in a shower of ancient dust. Julian Sterling lunged for the papers, his face a mask of desperate, localized greed, but Alistair's sword was already at his throat. The Duke did not strike. He simply held the man in place with the cold, immovable weight of his own restored authority. He told Sterling that the audit was over, and the insolvency of his character was total. He looked at Alara then, his grey eyes acknowledging her not as a guest or a spy, but as the master of the house. Alara stood at the head of the table, her fingers resting on the vellum of the society's original charter. She looked at the 12 men, then out at the shadows of the manor that had sheltered her mother for 7 years. She realized then that Miriam Vance was not just a founder. She was a surveyor who had built a world that could only be saved by someone who knew the value of the invisible labor that held it together. The house was settled, the ledger was balanced, and for the first time in 7 years the air tasted of the sharp, clean promise of a new morning. She had aimed to expose a secret society, but she had stayed to become its architect. The reckoning was complete, and the new order was about to begin. The air in the Sanguine vault remained thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of the master reset, but the silence that followed the Duke's command was of a different quality, a balance of terror and sudden, sharp realization. Julian Sterling stood paralyzed, his fingers still clutching at the air where his forged power had once been, while the 12 masked members of the order remained frozen in their seats like stone monuments to a dead era. Alara Vance did not look at the fallen usurper. She did not indulge in the common vanity of a triumphant smile. She kept her eyes on the master clockwork mechanism at the center of the obsidian table, her fingers steady, as she felt the final vibrations of the mechanical artifact settling into its housing. The gears had stopped their frantic grinding, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum that sounded like the steady breathing of a giant at rest. The house was no longer a weapon in the hands of a thief. It was a fortress returned to its architect. From the deepest shadows of the chamber, where the torchlight failed to penetrate the damp limestone walls, a figure emerged with a quiet, rustling dignity. Mistress Pringle did not move with the haste of a servant or the nervousness of a witness. The housekeeper walked with a straight, unyielding spine, her black bombazine skirts sweeping the flagstones with a sound like a long, suppressed sigh. She carried a small silver tray, and upon it lay a single, ivory-handled taper. She did not look at Sterling as she passed him. She did not acknowledge the nobleman with anything more than a brief, professional nod. Her focus was entirely on Alara, her gaze containing a mixture of ancient sorrow and a fierce, protective pride that had been hidden behind the mask of domestic service for 7 long years. Beatrix spoke, her voice a low, melodic alto that carried through the vaulted ceiling with the weight of a decree. She informed Elara that the restoration of the vaults was only the first entry in the audit of the evening. She noted that the architect had always intended for the daughter to find the mother's heart once the house had been secured from the intruders. She gestured toward a narrow, iron-bound door at the very back of the chamber, a portal so perfectly integrated into the masonry that Elara had missed it during her initial survey. It was the entrance to the sub-basement, a space deeper than the archives and more private than the Duke's own study. Alistair Thorne stepped forward, his sword still drawn but lowered toward the floor. He looked at Beatrix, then at Elara, his winter-grey eyes reflecting a sudden profound understanding of the housekeeper's true role. He realized then that Mistress Pringle was not merely the gatekeeper of the manor's secrets. She was the living memory of Miriam Vance's vision. He offered his arm to Elara, his touch through the silk of her glove a silent affirmation of their partnership. He did not lead her. He walked beside her as an equal, a steward following the inheritor into the final sanctum of the order. The descent into the sub-basement was a journey through the cooling marrow of Malvern Manor. The temperature dropped until the air tasted of frost and old water, the walls here lacking the polished marble of the upper vault. This was a space of raw engineering, where the massive lead weights of the manor's clockwork hung from rusted chains, and the scent of heavy machine oil was thick enough to coat the tongue. At the center of the room stood the master clockwork device, a structure of gleaming brass and silver that looked like a celestial orrery, its hundreds of gears moving in a slow, hypnotic dance that regulated the invisible labor of the Shadow Empire. Mistress Pringle led them to a small circular alcove at the base of the machine. She used her taper to light a series of oil lamps, their amber glow revealing a collection of silver-cased cylinders filed in velvet-lined drawers. She explained that Miriam Vance had known the danger of written records in an age of betrayal. The architect had recorded her final directives not in ink, but in the vibrations of the clockwork itself. Beatrix selected a specific cylinder, her fingers moving with the precision of a master clerk, and inserted it into a small, horn-shaped resonator attached to the central gear. The sound that emerged was not the scratchy, artificial tone of a machine. It was a voice, a sharp, elegant baritone that Elara had heard in every dream for 7 years. Miriam Vance did not sound like a woman in exile. She sounded like a strategist conducting a final review of a complex plan. The recording began with a technical audit of the society's purpose. Miriam spoke of the secret brotherhood as a society for the preservation of the unseen, a network designed to protect the labor of the poor and the integrity of the realm from the arrogance of a peerage that had forgotten the source of its wealth. She said that true power was not a matter of titles or lands, but a matter of stewardship over the invisible threads that held the world together. Elara stood before the resonator, her hands folded over the silver-cased notebook in her reticule. She did not weep. She did not allow the sound of her mother's voice to break the stoic discipline she had cultivated in the cold, grey silence of her mourning. She listened with the mind of an auditor, recording every instruction and every philosophy into the ledger of her own identity. Miriam spoke of the test, the reason she had left Elara behind. She explained that the architect's mantle could not be inherited. It had to be earned through the meticulous restoration of a ruined legacy. She said that she had faked her death not to escape her daughter, but to ensure that when Elara finally arrived at Malvern, she would do so as a master of her own competence, not as a ward of her parent's shadow. The recording ended with a final rhythmic ticking of the gears. The silence that returned to the sub-basement was expansive and warm, a stark contrast to the mineral cold of the stone. Mistress Pringle stepped back, her hands clasped in front of her bombazine apron. She told Elara that the architect was still watching, moving through the peripheries of the realm to ensure the new order was established with the same precision as the old. She noted that the carriage was waiting at the iron gates, and Silas Higgins had already been informed that the audit was complete. Elara turned to Alistair, the flickering lamplight catching the silver threads of her mask. She declared that Sal's Society for the Preservation of the Unseen required a new ledger, one that accounted for the corruption of the past 18 months, and the restoration of the original charters. She said that she was no longer a journalist seeking a story, or a daughter seeking a ghost. She was the architect of the reckoning, and she intended to manage the Malvern estate with the same clinical mathematical certainty that her mother had used to build it. Alistair bowed, a gesture of profound respect that acknowledged her not as a guest, but as the sovereign of the vault. He confessed he had spent 7 years waiting for an auditor who could match the frequency of the house. He said that he was ready to begin the work of balancing the debts. They ascended from the sub-basement, their footsteps echoing against the stone in a synchronized rhythmic pulse. When they returned to the sanguine vault, the scene had changed. The masked members were gone, escorted to the upper manor by guards who had recognized the Duke's restored authority. Julian Sterling sat alone at the obsidian table, his hands bound in iron, his arrogance replaced by the hollow grey stare of a man who had finally realized the insolvency of his own character. He looked at Elara, his lips curling in a final weak attempt at an insult. He spat that she would never be accepted by the peerage, for she was a woman whose fingers were stained with ink and whose mind was filled with the numbers of a merchant. Elara did not respond with a shout. She did not reach for the needle blade in her bodice. She walked to the table and picked up the record of deviation, the criminal ledger Sterling had kept to document his exploitation. She looked at him with a gaze that was as cold and impartial as a winter frost. She informed him that the peerage was a ledger of names, but she was the one who held the pen. She proclaimed that his name had already been struck from the accounts, his assets liquidated to repay the debts he had accrued against the people of the realm. The mechanical key was not a fragment of metal. It was the sovereign seal of a legacy that had finally found its rightful auditor. She turned away from Sterling as the guards led him toward the sanguine vault's literal prison cells. She stood at the head of the obsidian table, her fingers resting on the vellum of the society's original charter. The house was settled, the gears were turning with a steady, peaceful rhythm. The invisible labor of the Malvern estate was once again under the protection of a mind that understood its value. The light of the morning was beginning to filter through the high, narrow windows of the foyer above, casting long, pale streaks of silver across the black marble. Elara adjusted the silk of her midnight gown. The weight of the silver-cased notebook, a comforting presence against her side. She thought of Silas Higgins waiting at the gates, his weathered face a map of a different kind of loyalty. She thought of her mother, Miriam Vance, a woman who had built a kingdom in the shadows, so her daughter could one day rule it in the light. She realized then that her missing mother had not founded a secret society. She had founded a standard of integrity that had survived the winter of betrayal. Alistair stood by the library door, waiting for her. He did not speak. He did not offer a romantic plea. He simply waited for her to complete her final inventory of the room. Elara took one last look at the master reset mechanism, then walked toward him. Her heart was not hammering. It was ticking with the relentless, unyielding certainty of a clock that had finally reached the hour of its own vindication. The mission was complete. The secret society was exposed, but it was also preserved. The architect's daughter had not just found her mother's secret. She had found her own kingdom. As she stepped out of the vault and into the crisp, clean air of the morning, the ledger of her life was finally, perfectly in balance. The restoration of the broken was complete, and the architecture of dignity was established for a new age.